Well, Dustin, here we are. We're in part 3, which we're titling Securing Our Kids. We introduced this whole thing with this idea of domino parenting, which would be you get one thing in place and you tip it over, and it just has so much potential energy turned into kinetic energy that just ripples out into our parenting journey. We talked about loving and connecting with our kids. We talked about correcting our kids. And I've even just got a quick story. I practiced this with my son Cohen because since we recorded our last episode, I had your voice in my head trying to do what Dustin says, where he just had this freak out with our family. And so I had your voice in a great way in my head saying, connect before correct. And so I had this beautiful moment with him where I got to sit down with him and say, hey, what are you feeling before I corrected his behavior? Yeah. Ended up being a beautiful moment with our family. But today we're transitioning into securing our kids. And so can you introduce this idea? What do we mean when we're talking about security and securing our kids? Why is it so important?
Yeah, so if you recall when we talk about the pillars of relationship, Jordan, the love and trustworthiness, right? That our kids are constantly asking those questions. And part of the process of securing our kiddos is where they are able to answer that for themselves, right? We're going to get into that, as we go along, even into the final episode here, is we're going to talk about that too, is what does it look like for them to be able to do it on their own?
Okay.
And so securing our kiddos is really giving them opportunity to discover, to experience a reasonable assurance of peace and safety within their experience and in the home, right? And that violations are not the norm, right? That they're abnormal, right? So that would be what I think the idea of security or securing them is, that those are moments of deviation because we're imperfect and that's going to happen, right?
Would part of a security, this is just totally off the cuff, but as you're saying that, would part of security even be when it comes to a violation that hopefully it's not the norm, but that it will be made right?
Yes, that's the thing. That's the process of how do I reestablish pillars with my kids, right? When I lose my temper and when I'm angry with the inability to emphasize a change in their behavior or whatever it is, like how do we recover? This is where we apologize. This is where we find reconciliation in our system. So that's part of the process of securing our kids, is to have a consistent system of correction and reconciliation.
Okay. So what would you advise? I want to get into defining security just a little bit, but maybe you can pick. Here's a choose your own adventure. Okay. I've got 2 questions. What would you advise that system to look like for securing? Let's say there has been a violation. How do we restore? Yeah. And then second, define security, because I think it's different than safety and comfort. So you pick which one you want to hit first. Which one knocks them over?
There's so many good things. So, I'll click the definition. So just kind of like I was saying earlier, that I think that security, in more its definition, is the reasonable assurance of peace. Meaning that I know that where I'm at is not going to have a frequency or a consistency of violation. Like I don't think that you're going to judge me or tell me call me names.
Sure.
I have reasonable assurance that that's going to be the case. Reasonable.
Okay.
So I think our kids have to do that same thing. That's what I think security and relationship looks like, as one of the pillars goes.
Which is different than safety, because and when I say safety, I almost mean like comfort, because sometimes things will be uncomfortable or messy in the midst of a secure space, right?
Yeah.
Would I be right there?
Sure. Typically security, safety, trustworthiness, they're interchangeable, but what you're saying as it pertains to comfort, for sure. That's much different. Security and comfort, completely different.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then give us a little bit of an overview of maybe a recommendation for, okay, let's say there's been a violation and the secure space has been, part of that's too because like safe space has become such a hot button word that means different things to different people. And so I like secured better anyways. Yes. But so let's say the security's been violated. Mm-hmm. Now what?
So I think what has to happen, we've talked a touch about this in previous episodes here, but what has to happen is there has to be a structure, a scaffolding in place for this.
Right.
So I can't remember if we talked about last time, but the idea of the metronomes, so there's an experiment that's, that they demonstrate this concept of spontaneous synchronization. So what they'll do is they'll have all these metronomes lined up on a board, and they have these kind of pivot points underneath, like a can or glass or something. And they'll set all these metronomes off at different times, and they will sync up spontaneously. It's fascinating. And why it's even possible for that to do that is because there's what we call a common, or what I call a common plane. There's the board, right, that allows for all of the metronomes to sync up. So what that looks like, we've talked about, you have a family motto, I do as well, which is part of our common play in mind. What Lehmans do, we love people and help people, we don't quit, right? So when something's out of, sync, when the kids are upset, even yesterday Camden did, he was not being a very good listener. It was bedtime and he was not wanting to go to bed. And so he was choosing to make decisions that were going against what he knew. Right. So I asked him, I said, is what you're doing loving? No. Is it helpful? No. Well, what should we do? And right back in sync. Yep. It was beautiful because that's our common plane. Yep. So first of all, you have to have, in order to secure your kids, you have to have a consistent structure that we can have as a baseline to fall back on when there's something out of sync. Yep, absolutely. Now, when there's a violation or something is out of sync, and if you can't correct it quickly, like my simple example was from yesterday, one of my favorite things I think I like to offer to parents is this thing I call process by osmosis. Okay. What does that mean? I can imagine Cohen sitting there and you and I talking about what just happened in your experience of what Cohen was doing. Yep. And for you and I to have a conversation, or you and Alyssa or whatever, to have a conversation about what that looks like, he's absorbing all sorts of information just by the observation. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's beautiful. Because really, you're allowing them to watch you two organize, plan, create a discipline, or some kind of structure to correct. Yeah. And it's safe because it's not necessarily something you're directing to him. Yeah. So that's another really big one I love to offer families.
So give me an example of so if there's a violation, let's say, one of the boys does something outside of our family values. Mm-hmm. You're saying this process through osmosis, did I get that right? Mm-hmm. Is, okay, there's been a violation. Now me and Alyssa are going to have a conversation about it in front of them to say, okay, Harvey made this decision or Cohen made this decision. Alyssa, how do we handle this? How do they learn?
Yeah. How do they learn how to do this, right? So when you do this in front of them, if you're up to this, I'd love for you to talk to me about your experience of Cohen as though he was sitting right here. I think that would be wild, man. Okay. And just for you to practice this as the example would be.
Sure. So Cohen was feeling really upset and felt, I think, left out a little bit. So he crawled into Alyssa's lap, and in his anger, he hit her. And so we scolded him immediately, said, hey, Cohen, that is not kind. That's not how we use our hands. And then he got upset and kind of snuggled in deeper. And then Harvey was trying to help him with something. He was genuinely trying to be helpful. And Cohen turned and smacked it and knocked it off the table. And so what I did was I picked up Cohen and I carried him to his bedroom and I sat down with Cohen. I said, Cohen, you were probably feeling something. What were you feeling? Yep. So he and I had a conversation and we explored the emotions that he was going through. And so then Cohen and I had a conversation. We said, hey, Cohen, how do we treat each other instead? Yeah. And then I held his hand and we walked back out into the living room or into the kitchen and said, hey, how do we make this right with both Alyssa and with Harvey? And he came along with me. It was part of the process. I don't know if that's what you wanted.
So if Cohen was sitting right here and he needed to hear how that impacted you, what would you want him to hear? That's great, the context. What would you want him to hear in your experience of all of it?
Oh, I would say, Cohen, that was really, really hard for me to watch you choose to step outside of who we are as Steingravers. Yeah. It made me upset to see you use your hands to hit Alyssa, somebody I care about and love, and somebody you love. Mm-hmm. That's hard to watch. Yeah. And then when Harvey was being helpful, to see you choose in your sadness instead of using your words.
Yeah. It's like
you were unkind.
Yep. Yeah. So if I was like Alyssa, I might say something like, it was hard for me to see Cohen choose to do something that I know doesn't represent him. Yep. If he's sitting right here, I'm going to say, it's hard for me to watch him, if I'm Alyssa, do something I know I know he loves you and I. I know he loves his brother. Yep. And so to watch it, I struggle with it because I feel stuck. I can't help him in that moment when he's acting like that to make a different decision because he's so upset. I feel stuck too. Yeah. Cohen, buddy, what's that like to hear? The idea that when you have that discussion about the impact of his behavior, not in any form of shame, you're not saying he's a horrible kid. Right. I'm so disappointed in him. Yep. Nope. Yep. It's the reference of because here's the deal. Les and Leslie Parrott, who've written a million books, but they have the Symbis test, and I just love it. They have this in my favorite book. It's called Relationships, or now it's Real Relationships. They have a bunch of nuggets, but one of them is vulnerability begets vulnerability. So in an age-appropriate way, if I'm talking about my experience, not making it their responsibility, because their job is not to take care of my feelings. But if I'm processing as an adult with another adult about the impact, and then I redirect as a way of saying, I love you, I know this isn't like you. Let's do it different, okay? Oh, process by
That's cool.
osmosis,
No,
man.
I really like that. Yeah. Thank you for that, because at first I was definitely not going the direction you were wanting me to. So thanks for the redirect. But I love that because I also like how the child gets to hear the heart that the parent has for them.
Yeah.
Like
100%.
even what I believe that's not who he is.
Yeah.
That he wants to make better decisions. I believe that. Oh man, that's not how he normally is. So. Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. And they just get to absorb
so
and
much.
listen to. That's awesome. I love that.
As long as it's not about shame, guilt, blame, any of that stuff, and making it their job to take care of your feelings, none of that's theirs. So,
Right. And
modeling appropriate conflict management, man. Oh,
yeah.
it's a great
Which
spot.
and this is a little bit of a digression or a tangent, whatever you want to call it. But that's something that I'm trying to work on too. And so I'm just here's some vulnerability, but in that space, trying to not tell them that you made me feel this way, because then that turns into where they're responsible for how I feel.
Every one of us, Jordan, does that.
Yeah.
I do that, man.
Yeah.
I'm so annoyed. You're so annoying. Stuff like that. I minimize it as often as I can. But it's when those moments happen that I get to come back to, like we said earlier, what's the structure, what's the common plane that says this is what we do. I will admit to my kids, that was not loving, that was not helpful. Forgive me, guys. Let's do this different, yeah? You want to do it different? Yeah.
Yeah, let's go. So even in that, before we move on to my next question would be, we talked a little bit pre-show or pre-recording about mirrored emotions. And so we have a violation, and even in my example that I just told, I put myself in a timeout that when I picked up Cohen and carried him to the room, I intentionally kept my mouth shut because I knew if I opened it, I would have to make an apology later. So I put him in his room, I set him down, and he's, screaming and crying and so upset, and I just closed the door and I walked away because I knew I need to process. But you talked a little bit about mirrored emotions where we're kind of a reflection of one another. I was incredibly upset in that moment, but so was he. Unpack this mirrored emotions and what's happening there.
Man, they're just so uniquely skilled, just intrinsically, to set us up to know what they're feeling based on the way that we're feeling, right? So if I'm feeling helpless and powerless with my kids, that's likely because that's what they're feeling. So they will manifest whatever feeling, and it will project onto me. I will start to feel that way. It's not, always that way, but it's really like a high likelihood that when I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling as it pertains to my kids, that's because that's what they're feeling.
Sure.
When I feel rejected or ignored, that's probably a common feeling they have, right? That maybe in that moment they're feeling. So to use that as like a filter, I think that is really powerful, because really what it does is gives me a different insight outside of my sense of comfort. I want to not have this feeling.
Right.
Into this place of insight, maybe abstract reasoning of like, man, my kiddos might be feeling this way. It gives me a different sense of what I could connect with or what target to pursue with them. And I'm telling you, very often that's what I experience with my own kids,
I like that as a compass, and it reminds me of, and this is a little bit, apparently I'm just going to do tangent after tangent today, but Simon Sinek in his book, Leaders Eat Last, talks about leadership from this framework, and he says, I might be butchering it, but I think he says, be the leader you wish you had. And it's kind of like this, where he goes, if you're craving something from your leader, there's a really good chance that the people you're leading are feeling the same way. So if you wish that your leader would give you more encouragement, then one of the best things you can do is turn around and give encouragement to those who are following you. And that's kind of what you're saying is like, man, if I'm feeling really upset right now, there's a really good chance they are too. Or if I'm feeling isolated, lonely, nervous, anxious, wow, they could be as well. So how can I step into that space with empathy instead of correction or anger?
Yep. Absolutely. And I mean, again, when kids are reacting, they don't necessarily have the ability to organize. So they're looking to us to help them with that, right? This is discipline or discipleship in its greatest sense. So that I get to show up and say, hey, let's do this just like you did with Cohen. Let's take a breath, buddy. Put your hand on my chest. Take a breath. I know that's tough. Even that, I'll take what you got. Good job, man. That was good. Let's do it one more time. Yeah, I think that's great.
So transitioning a little bit, how do we create a secure home without being, there's two phrases that come to my mind about parenting that are a little bit on the negative side. Snowplow parents and helicopter parents. I'll define them this way, even though they might not be fully accurate. They're just the way I would understand them. Helicopter parenting being somebody who's constantly hovering and making sure everything's okay, just buzzing around. And then you've got the snowplow parent, which would be somebody who's constantly removing the obstacles so that the child, the kid, doesn't have to experience anything bad on some level, where they're just removing the obstacles so the kid makes it through clean slate. So when we're trying to create a secure home, how do we invite the messiness of that process and not try and clean it all up all the time? Does that make sense?
It definitely does. Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people kind of get out of whack of maybe what the ideal is with respect to like not doing more than they ought.
Yep.
Right. So our kiddos, they obviously come into the world with this dependency on us. They can't take care of themselves. They require us to do this, right? And over a period of time, there's this kind of natural curve where we start to give up control and they start to assume control, right? It's the idea that we delegate and they assume, right? And parents those of us who may step over the idea of what's typical or ideal in that to say, hey, I need to remove this because I know what I'm doing and you don't, or whatever the implication with that is. I think the big deal with this is like knowing what is truly the goal in it.
Right.
Is it one of comfort like we've talked about before?
Right.
Is it comfort, or is it one that they need to discipleship, right? Where they need to assume and develop a new behavior. Camden just started kindergarten this week. And it was tough to watch him line up in his group of people that he doesn't know. He didn't know anybody, any of these kiddos, none of them. And so for him to line up in a group of people that he's not comfortable with, it was tough for me to just let him be and not to like coach him through that, right? To watch him look at me and I give him the, a little bit of like, you got this, dude. You got this, bud. And off and away he went. He kept looking back, giving me the smile, like making sure I was still there watching. And off and away he went, and he did just fine, right? The idea is like, how does that look as they get older, right? Riding a bike without training wheels, right? Or going to the place where driving a car, learning how to drive a car, or getting into a more intimate, deep relationship with people, best friends, or dating, or otherwise. What am I going to continue to step in and try to mitigate their difficulty or their struggle? If I do, what's the cost? And I think that's what happens with the helicopter or snowplow parent is they really don't want their kids to suffer. And I respect that. I don't want my kids to suffer, but we know what suffering produces, right? Perseverance. Perseverance, character, and character, hope. So if I interrupt that suffering, a good, normal, typical type of suffering, man, I'm getting in the way of their development.
Which, one more tangent would be like, spiritually and in our culture, we have horrible, that's maybe too aggressive. It seems like we can have a horrible or a bankrupt view of suffering because our Western culture is constantly telling us what we need, what we deserve, and how to medicate our pain. And so we don't have a great, sometimes, approach to go, what is this suffering for? We just want to end it and get over it. And we could go down that rabbit trail for a long time. So, but connected to that is I think there's a desire in us that we want to create a comfortable place at the cost of a healthy environment. And you just even brought that up. Like, what's the cost of taking away the suffering? And so how do we give us some maybe framework, if you can, of how do we do that? How would we maybe reframe a perspective in the moment when we want to step in to say, and maybe it's as simple as a phrase that maybe you would understand if you follow Jesus of count the cost. Like, what is the cost of this? But is there something that you can give us as a tool to go, hey, before you step in, before you remove the suffering, think this first? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. The example that comes to mind, I just talked about training wheels. Last summer, right before Camden, he was a couple months before he turned 4. I was like, dude, it is time for you to learn to ride this bike without training wheels. So maybe as an analogy would go, right? So I take him off, and do you think I just let him go? No, of course not, right? So I'm holding the handlebars, I'm holding the seat. Then we run. I run with him, and he let him go a little bit, and he starts. Well, I grab him again, and over a period of time, it went from holding the handlebars, I'm holding the seat, then I'm just behind him, and off and away he goes, and he's doing just fantastic. And the reason he can do fantastic, he had a few falls. In fact, there was one time, it was so funny. He's riding, and he didn't remember how to stop. He's running right towards the garage, and so I'm trying to catch him, and he just right into the garage. Oh, he fell on the ground and he just was giggling. He was just giggling, and Addie and I were just laughing. It was super funny. But the idea is that he even had enough opportunity for him to figure out what didn't work, failure, right, in order to figure out what did work. I helped him with the ideal, like, this is how it feels, this is how you go, with a little bit of assistance, and off and away he went. So the idea is that as it turns into, going forward, securing our kids and helping them, not going too far, is you go shoulder to shoulder with them, right? Mm-hmm. Initially, you give them the representation, which is also why I love this process by osmosis, because you're doing very much the same. One of my favorite things with that is the shoulder to shoulder, or the representation of conflict in front of kiddos in a healthy, appropriate, well-adjusted way, is that they then will start to do it with you.
Yeah.
They'll start to replicate that with you, and that is just so awesome.
Yeah.
When kids say, I can do this, which is part of the natural tendency to say, less dependence on you, let me try this out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, and I, even as you're talking through that, I think some things that came to mind with your analogy of riding the bike is I think sometimes too what we need as parents, or at least I'll say this about myself, is I need to see them fall over and then get up and go, I'm okay. Yeah. And I need to, okay, they're fine. They didn't, this isn't an emergency room trip, because sometimes I can spiral into, what if he breaks his arm? Oh, okay, well, we'll figure that out. But then not only for me to see it, but then for them to also experience, I fell and I'm okay. I can get back up and do it.
There's one other bit to this too that's interesting, is that while you help your kids, and I help my kids kind of learn to do things on their own, and I don't take their comfort as my responsibility forever, there's also a part for us in this, right? Where we're looking to maintain this idea that who I am is separate than what my kids are, right? And that's another big huge deal, right? Is that if I see that their success as a representation of me, that's dangerous, because who I am is completely separate, and they'll then get caught in that trap of I have to make sure mom or dad are okay. So going into this, it's also a way for us to get off the training wheels as well, right? Of how can I be okay? Because guess what? How long do I have the kids in my home? And at some point, as we'll get into, right, this looks like something I have to practice and have been prepared to do.
Yeah. Which is a great segue. Two thoughts, hopefully I remember them both. But Alyssa and I were just yesterday having a conversation about we're almost halfway done raising Harvey, which was my eyes were tearing up. I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we're almost halfway there. But to continually remember, and I wanted to pull this out because I thought this was a nugget you said earlier, which is, what is the goal? Yeah. And so I think so often, and this is a common phrase surrounding parenting, is we feel the days are long, but the years are short. Yeah. And so constantly reminding myself, hey, there's a bigger goal here. And I'll even say that to Harvey. One of the things I'll say is hey, it's my job to help you make good decisions. I want you to be able to make good decisions, to grow up and know how to do that. So that's why we talk about consequences and these things, because you need to know, you make a choice, there's going to be good consequences, bad consequences, and it's my job to help you navigate that. But to remember, if that's the goal, then that's how you have to filter everything, but we get lost in those moments. But as we distance ourselves and go, okay, they're not a reflection of me. I mean, more tangents we could go down, but even what sports do you like? What are you interested in? Do you like music? Do you not like music? Because you discover, I really want that for them. Why? Because that's what I care about, reflection. But as they age, as they choose different things, let's talk, let's wrap up our conversation with this concept. As they age, how do we continue to secure them in a healthy way so that we're not trying to secure a 16, 17, 18-year-old. I'm not there yet. The same way I'm trying to secure a 4-year-old.
Yeah. Okay, so there's kind of essentially the playbook, right? Where you have this family structure, you got it all sorted kind of in terms of what makes you, the common plane, as I've said earlier, right? But then there's also these, what do we do if, right? So if there's the process by osmosis would be, what do we do if, right? Or, you connect before you correct. When discipline or whatever's necessary or whatever. And the other thing would be on that side, right, is that from infancy up through high school or beyond, is that there has to be kind of a red line, right? When is it too much for you to engage, right? So from 0 to 10, 10 being the worst, 5 or above is the point of no return. You don't do conflict, don't do engagement. You do kind of securing the space, and then you take your time out like you did, right? Which is what you do with heart. 5 or above, that's not where you get very much done. So as kids up through high school, what we're hoping to do when they get older and become less dependent upon us is that they can start to activate the disciplines that they've that they've had in the practice of our home, that they get to have they'll have a lot more emotions, but they'll have a lot more ability to manage and regulate those emotions, right? So going forward, we as they get older, we are good at reminding instead of instilling.
Sure.
So that's the difference between infancy and high school as well. But really the idea is like making sure that, play starts to change, but making sure that you play, right? Even up through high school, it doesn't go away. It just changes, right? Like,
sure.
You play games, board games, you do whatever kind of sports events together,
Yep.
you go on trips and you do different kind of play. But play is huge, always. So that would be another bit. And I feel like I missed a part of your question. But I think in terms of the structure, that's how it gravitates over time from independence or from dependence to independence.
Yeah.
And kids have to practice that as well. So do we practice letting them have that
Yeah.
independence.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I like that idea of even playing throughout that your structure of play and the way you play, the way you interact, that it doesn't go away.
Yeah.
It just changes
Yeah.
and evolves. And that's one of the things that even for me as my boys age is like, oh man, there's new, more fun things. As I mourn some of their younger years,
Yeah.
I also get to now step into new ways to engage and have fun.
Think about what Harvey and Cohen will learn when they're stronger than you, when they're wrestling with you and you
Yeah.
can't get out.
Yeah.
Think about what they learn about themselves
That's
at
a
that
whole
point.
different thing. Yeah. I mean, there's been a couple times, and then we'll wrap up. But there's been a couple times where we have been wrestling, and Harvey's getting strong.
Yeah.
And there's a couple times he has surprised me where he's knocked me over. I'm going, where did that come from? Like you're getting big, kid.
Yeah.
But Dustin, thank you so much. And then we'll shift gears for our next episode. But thanks for your time. Sure appreciate you.
Yeah, thanks.